You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Michael Garfield. He's a paleontologist / futurist. He's an evolutionary theorist and multimedia artist, and he's created some provocative work, talking conversations about our future and a deep study of big history. He's a public speaker for 14 years and a performer on the trail of a new unifying theory to explain major evolutionary transitions, including one that we all are participating in. And he now splits his time between hosting the Future Fossils podcast and working in communications at the Santa Fe Institute. So, Mike, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, tell me about your work. What you try to describe major evolutionary transitions, and it looks like you're talking about how we are co-evolving with technology. So, can you give a little bit of background on what your thinking has been in this area?
Yeah, I went to school for vertebrate paleontology. I was doing field work every summer in Wyoming, digging up Jurassic dinosaur fossils and reconstructing their ecologies under the mentorship of Robert Bacher, who, for any fellow dinosaur fan, will know the name. He was a consultant on Jurassic Park and hugely influential in reshaping the way that people imagine dinosaurs as active, warm-blooded, family living creatures with this dynamic ecosystem that is, in reality, so much richer than we imagined it was even a decade ago. But at any rate, I was getting deeper and deeper into the study of ecologies and ecological transitions, and right there working at the boundary around the origin of flowering plants, which has persisted throughout my life in a really beautiful way, a sort of an orienting mystery, right? Because it's a moment of extraordinary creativity where entire new ecosystems come online, and there's a total proliferation of niches. All of the new pollinating plant-specific creatures, the beetles and the birds and so on, erupt into this space. And in a lot of ways, that event is like the event that we're living through right now, where the whole ecosystem becomes much more hyper-connected, much more complex. And much later on, I read about this in the work of Richard Doyle at Penn State. But he's someone I really respect, and has given this very thing a real thorough once over with respect to information theory as well as rhetoric, and the way that we're actually thinking and metaphorizing these things in science. So at any rate, this isn't a linear story of this stuff, but the more I got into and the more I learned about these, the way that individual organisms, species, ecosystems are transforming in order to accommodate these surges in creativity that are made possible by a sort of recombinant force in evolution that exists in order to best manage the dissipation of energy across a landscape. And we're talking the origin of photosynthesis, and then the emergence of an oxygen metabolism, in order to integrate this waste product that had polluted the atmosphere, that was toxic to all life up to that point. It's at every point we we sort of like paint ourselves into a corner, and by we I
Mm.
mean like the biosphere, everything on Earth, and we have to align into much more complex new forms in different ways, different meaningful, like kind of scientifically specific ways, and and even though individual organisms don't necessarily themselves all follow the same sort of evolutionary trajectory, when you look at it in aggregate, what you see are these moments that are like time and time again in the history of the planet. There are these sort of remix epochs where some new way of linking organisms together occurs as a
Mm.
spontaneous solution to some sort of crisis in the ecosystem at like a very basic thermodynamic level. And so we're in one right now. And, we're
Right.
seeing, on the one hand, unprecedented extinctions, on the other hand, unprecedented levels of innovation and rapid change that's making a lot of people uncomfortable. So it's a good way to frame things, that is to say deeply, in order to understand what's going on now, so that we have at least something to hold on to.
Well, I realized I haven't talked to anyone about paleontology, so while I have you, if you don't mind, can you tell me a few interesting things about dinosaurs, like you said, that we've learned, in the past 10, 20 years that, the public doesn't really know about? What's the new newness about them?
Well, I mean, the beauty is that a lot of this stuff is being very well reported, but the angle on it that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, the sort of how of this thing, is that so much of the new discoveries that have been happening around the world are because the so-called developing world is developing and is tearing up a lot of land to put in buildings, and so you have a massive displacement of Earth, like humans, as a process of erosion that is really unprecedented in history. And so, like the weird thing about the fact that we're living in a golden age of paleontology is that it is precisely because we are living in what other scholars have named the Anthropocene, the human age, at which the age that we are living, that we are leaving a geological record, that we are like the dominant geological force on land on this planet right now. And that's to articulate it that way is to emphasize that we are a geological force, not that we somehow like transcend nature, but that we are literally like an epiphenomenon of the wind and earth and so on. And so it's humbling. But at any rate, I think that's the thing to consider about dinosaurs, is like they always represented the dragons on the edge of the map, and as our map grows, so too do the edges in this cool fractal way, right? And part of that is a psychological evolution where we're becoming more and more cognizant of these sort of internal dragons at the edges of the maps of our sort of understandings of the human mind. And on the other side is like we are literally digging up tons of buildings. Like many of these new discoveries in the last 15, 20 years have been in China. And that's really where some of the most exciting stuff has been, where, the history of the family of Tyrannosaurus, these tiny little things that ultimately grew up to be this, monstrous, iconic thing. We have a really clear fossil record of that stuff from Eastern Asia now, 50, 70 million years before Tyrannosaurus Rex. So that's a beautiful thing.
Hmm.
Steve Brusati, who is a legitimate practicing field paleontologist and was deeply immersed in that specific research. I had him on Future Fossils podcast on episode 70, and he was talking about that. He's a cool guy. He's about my age, and it's cool to see folks in my cohort who were like studying this stuff the same time I was in college now, and like stuck with it, and are now like the ones that are the talking heads in media, like Bob Barker was when I was a kid, and like looking up to him. So that's an oblique answer to your question.
Okay. Well, so you said we're going through a major evolutionary change right now. So what does that mean? What what will we see or experience? What do you think is going to happen over the next however many years where we see evidence that we're going through a major evolutionary change?
Well, okay, so I like thinking of it in terms of phase transitions, which, like from physics, thinking about, boiling a pot of water, or, the way that frost forms on a windshield. Life is this pattern that emerges at an energetic gradient at a boundary in nature. Dorian Sagan co-authored, I hope I am forgiven for forgetting the other author's name, but there's this great book, Into the Blue, which is about this thermodynamics and self-organization. And this is increasingly, this view, which was articulated by Ilya Prigogine in 1973, that living systems are dissipated structures, that the metabolism exists to sort of close an energy gradient in an ecosystem. That view has sort of expanded into a multi-scale investigation, where people are looking at the way that organisms at all levels, from individual cells within the tissues, within these different organ systems, to the animal, to the society that it lives in, to the ecosystem, to the entire planet, and then basically the solar system even, are all sort of different frames of this single metabolic process. So that's one big piece of it, And so to look at the amount of free energy that humans have unleashed, through these successive technological revolutions, especially over the last few hundred years, that is a huge piece of why we are experiencing this explosion in information. Because there are thermodynamic costs of an irreversible computation, like a computation occurring in a body. A thinking organism navigating through its environment. We are looking for sort of like every available grain of sugar in this thing. And, so in a way that Kevin Kelly articulated beautifully in What Technology Wants, we are just sort of participating at first mindlessly, and now at least potentially mindfully, in this sort of cosmic relay race in which we persist as human beings, in whatever sense we choose to adhere to that. And that's an interesting term to just put a pin in that. That's going to be a hotly contested notion, what it is to be a human being in this century, as we get more competent with like our genetic editing and manipulation of the human genome. But yeah, I mean, so like what's going on now is akin to what's always happened at one of these transitions, where like the 25 different times or so, at least 25 different times, that multicellularity emerged independently in different strains of life. And so it's, as a response, it sort of compresses each of us into a new structure in which there's greater diversity, greater innovation, the pace of life is greater. Jeffrey West writes about this in his book Scale. Jeff West was the former president at Santa Fe Institute, and he talks about this with respect to cities, and how cities are these boiler innovation zones because of the density of connections between people and the number of times people encounter one another. And so, he's found that cities demonstrate a metabolism similar to ecosystems, but just scaled up, and that companies demonstrate a metabolism similar to individual organisms, but just scaled up, in the sense that companies tend to die, but like sort of boil up within ecosystems. I mean, within cities, in the same way that organisms come and go within these ecosystems. So, I mean, that is to say that the main transition that we're really going through right now is a conceptual one. It's a worldview one, in which we understand that we are embedded inside of things. Not that we're like on the planet, but in important ways we are like within all of these different layers. And I think that's only going to become more obvious with a more thorough implementation of augmented reality, when that sort of becomes part of the fabric of human daily experience. Because, when our sensory realm becomes so palpably hypertextual, then, everything will feel much more layered and natural in that sense. And I think in that sense, more accurate to what's actually going on, because, as like Marshall McLuhan was saying decades ago, that, we are all sort of within this giant nervous system now.
You think people will be more aware of their environment if they're in augmented or virtual reality, or less aware?
Well, two parts, right? One is what environment, and then two is both, because what happens is that there's a constant expansion of possibility, basically, as the sort of subunits of ever greater macro level systems with ever more emergence and novelty become themselves more diverse in order to support what is the sort of like dark side of this, is that what we're really talking about is an increase in the regulatory complexity of these bigger and bigger systems. So, we become more and more collective. Like even Teilhard de Chardin was saying this in the 50s, that we become hyper specialized as we become hyper collectivized. And so I think, people will become, there will be some people that are more and some people that are less aware of what is going on. And that's a pretty natural, one would expect to see that kind of distribution.
So do you see us merging with AI or with other technology, or becoming more like cyborgish? I mean, I know we'll have augmented virtual reality, but what about our physical bodies? Where do you think that's going?
Well, it's a timeline thing. But in another respect, there's a deeply important way in which it doesn't matter how far out you look into futures, plural, to ask that kind of a question, because the answer is going to have more to do with for whom that relationship is occurring. And for, the indefinite foreseeable future, human beings will, be starting sort of at, biological square one, being born into these different environments, but in a way that, that people still have to develop psychologically from childhood through to adulthood, and develop the complexity of their conscious ego structures, and so it's strange that William Gibson has that famous thing about the future is already here, it's just distributed unevenly. And he's not just talking about technological change, he's talking about cognitive sophistication. And so like the way that this answers your question is that there have been people for years that, like Catherine Hales and Donna Haraway in the post-humanist conversation, in terms of like post-humanism as a branch of literary theory, that have been saying that, the integration of a truly postmodern philosophy and cybernetic technology is that, the human is a provisional identity, and that it's sort of up for grabs, and that it's going to become a terrain in which people have always felt, in some sense, in pre-modern societies, an identity with sacred tools, a continuity with them. We rejected this in the modern world, but there's no reason why it's not just sort of more natural to human cognition to think of ourselves as cyborgs, even though that's not the term we used to use. That like to think about merging with the machine is to ignore all of the ways that we are already intimate with the technologies that we use. To carry a phone with us at all times, to sleep with it next to us. These things are penetrating our electromagnetic fields. And in important ways, it's not really adequate to our modern environment to regard the skin as the edge of the human body. We live in a deeply saturated electromagnetic environment, and therefore I think it's important to regard the the actual electromagnetic envelope of the human being as sort of the extent of us, which is why so many people are sensitive about personal space and like emotional contagion in crowds, because we literally do biologically synchronize with one another. This is really well studied with firewalkers, but that's besides the point. Like just to try and like give you a sort of like cherry on top of this. Yes, there will be all sorts of, people are already making brain nets between people, I mean, we don't need to wait on legislation to say this is okay if you're willing to experiment on yourselves. I mean, technology is going to rush ahead of us in every conceivable direction. People will remix brain-body interfaces in every imaginable way. People will reject these technologies in creative ways we didn't anticipate. I mean, that's the point, is that like, because the nature of the evolutionary change that we're going through right now is a recombinant change, it is akin to the emergence of syntactic language. Like it's akin to the moment when we stopped speaking in single word utterances and started speaking in sentences, except the informational unit here those units are social. So those units are individual people, like being linked together into, social or techno-social units of groups of people, meta-organisms. This is, there's a similar kind of cyborg interfacing going on between governments and private institutions, that I think is worth keeping an eye on as its own form of endosymbiosis. So the ultimate message is sort of like that weird is the new normal, and that like people are going to do all sorts of weird things, and yeah.
Well, they may do weird things, but what do you think are going to be some of the more dominant trends over the next, I don't know, 50 to 100 years?
50 to 100 is hard to say. I mean, I think the thing that has always most interested me is a moment ago we were talking about, the augmented reality or mixed reality, and like Peter Watts, this Canadian science fiction writer, he wrote these fabulous books, Blind Sight and Echopraxia, that interrogate the notion that human consciousness is evolutionarily adaptive at the galactic scale, that maybe it's just a localized fluke that it worked for us here, and that other more intelligent forms are, sort of better suited. But he talks about in those books this system called consensus, where we don't really use screens anymore. We're just sort of projecting things through neural interfaces into what appear to be common spaces, but they're not. It's not even really like a holographic projector. It's literally just neural stimulation. And I think that's a likely end to this for one strain of humanity. And I think that strain of humanity is going to find itself up against some real xenophobia. I mean, it's impossible, I think, for the humankind not to really speciate at this point. And I'm not just talking about like the rich versus the poor, because I think that, like people like Douglas Rushkoff have made a really good cases about that a lot of this technological development is driven by billionaires wanting to escape apocalypse. Their own sort of post-industrial or meta-industrial transnational activities are accelerating, hastening. but there's this other sense in which it really is just a proliferation of empowered garage biolabs and other weird hackery. I mean, I know so many people in Austin where you are, where they have the body hacking conference every year. They just had it in February, and they, that's one of so many places in just this one country that this sort of radical self-experimentation is being embraced and encouraged, and people are sharing their information with each other. And we're like the human beings are like the prototypical driverless car network. We're like good at updating one another, not quite as good as those driverless cars, but like that is a goal for many people. So it's easy to imagine brain nets being a vital currency of some future culture. And and in that sense, it's interesting to imagine what all of the other types of human beings might do sort of around that. that because that's a sort of a distinct thing from honoring the individual in some sort of way, but then still um, using brain stimulation to edit the personality or something. There's a whole bunch of different ways that this can spill, and for me, it's just interesting to think of it as an ecosystem of all of these different strategies of people trying to find their way in an increasingly an information and energy rich future. You know, it's a curious portrait.
So I don't know. Are there any major, we're going to walk around, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years from now? I'm not sure what time scale you have insight into, but at what point do you think we're going to walk around and things really will be truly very different than they are now?
Uh, well, that's the funny thing. I mean, change is scale dependent, right? Like, and also path dependent in the sense that, a lot of big changes happen from small origins, but they're at like particular points of nodal influence in the the scheme of things. So, like to talk about when change will come, like, I'm fond of the Louis C.K. Thing about how, by the time, just by the statistics that I think he said, we're doing this show before Christmas, and by Christmas, two of you in this audience will be dead. you know, so for them, it's a real big difference very soon. And I used to be in my 20s. I used to be much more uh, apocalyptic and epochalist, and I was, very very convinced that the singularity was coming rather soon. And as I have aged, I feel I have gotten, 10 years down the line, I feel like I've gotten a better view of what change that happens in a moment in the geological record really looks like on the streets. And, it's not to say that things aren't happening fast here, because they are unprecedentedly fast. Um, but it is to say that, I don't know, I mean, for different people who are accommodated or acclimated to and accommodating to different degrees of change, to people who are more like comfortable of tolerating ambiguity and paradox, a weird future is not going to be as weird. It'll be easier for these people to embrace it. Like the difference between pleasure and pain is one sort of relationship to the intensity of that neural stimulus, or so I hear from every single person that I have ever speak out of like the BDSM community. So I think that, like when will really intense radical change occur? I mean, it's happening. It's happening right now.
Well,
I think it's yeah.
What's an example of some of the most extreme change that you've seen that's happening right now?
I think that I'm getting more comfortable allowing auto completion in my digital communication, and I'm getting more and more comfortable with AI assistance. And I think that that's like, in certain ways, that's really being hyped up by technologists. In other ways, it is kind of a sleeper thing in our society, like all of these different ways that we are starting to use not AI. That's like such a pain, like a counterproductively simple way of thinking about this, to refer to it in the singular. Like we're talking about a blooming ecosystem of different kinds of machine intelligences, thousands and thousands of different kinds that have been evolved for different purposes. And so, I mean, really, I think that is sort of the most significant and radical and evolutionarily significant thing that's going on right now. But we're at a very early step of it. And when it's all said and done, I gave this talk at MoogFest 2016 about how I feel that at the end of the 21st century, we will have returned to something more like jungle indigenous shamanism, or like, the sort of medicine traditions of Brazil, than what we have now, insofar as we will be living in this mysterious, animated space that is pregnant with design and intention and that every surface we encounter is rife with meaning and interactivity. And to me, that sounds like the spaces illustrated by like visionary artists like Luis Tomani and Pablo Amaringo. These ayahuasca painters who just knock this kind of thing out of the park. I mean, they're looking at it from through that lens of that particular tradition. But I think that when we design through through thermodynamic necessity, systems of increasingly adroit biomimicry, then we end up in these spaces like Josh Wolf of Lux Capital was on Farnham Street podcast talking about this, about how designoid surfaces that we allow algorithms to evolve for us are going to become more and more normal, and our designed environments are going to start resembling more and more like fractal or natural type spaces, like grown rather than made. And so, I think that's a big trend in the future, and that will be concomitant with this growing acceptance that we live within the cosmos, that we're sort of like in the belly of the whale. I have an essay up on Medium about that, which sort of emerged from my experiences with Google Glass and like living inside the heads-up display, and realizing that that this is sort of, that even as the sort of technological element that we interface with grows smaller and smaller, and again, Kevin Kelly has said this before me and very eloquently, that it actually is dependent on this much larger technological infrastructure that is sort of occluded. It's like sunk into the ocean in order to like dump heat or whatever. That we hide the sort of the guts of this thing, as the guts of the creature are sort of always hidden. But that nonetheless, we are in that sense within the belly of what he calls the technium. That this living technological globe encircling thing that we have extruded. So yeah, that's the big change.
Well, very good. We're just about out of time here. So I can see online you have a number of posts, and you talked about a Medium post and other you've been a speaker for a long time. Where's the best place for listeners to find out more about your work and your thought process? Oh,
you can go to michaelgarfield.net. I have my Patreon page linked from my Twitter. At Michael Garfield is Twitter and Instagram. I have, for the last 10 years, also done hundreds of paintings, science inspired, and completed at festivals and concerts all over the place. So there's an Instagram too. Surprise. Anyway, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, excellent. All right. You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.